Okay, we're going to take a look at the secret history of post-Paul Church, part 2, and this is going to focus on Tertullian's remarks. This is 207 AD. He's going to write a book called Agianst Marcion. 207 AD, Tertullian has to fight Paul-only Marcionites. Okay, and now Tertullian, in order to battle against this view where Paul is the only apostle in this new system, he's going to go after that, and he's going to go after a lot of different things. But and I wrote an article on this, and then someone at Early Church 101 took umbrage against my view that the thrust of Agianst Marcion had a negative aspect to it against Paul, and he said no, and he even got a professor to write a letter to him that says no, it's not that negative against Paul. Well, I just want to say is the best evidence is the Early Church 101 person said, go look up Lindzeman and read him. And so I wrote him back and I said, well, here's what Lindzeman says. And there's a quote here. Lindzeman says, the writings of Paul, the hereticorum apostolos, which means the apostle of the heretics, a negative statement, right? The hereticorum apostolos of Tertullian, that's what appears in this book, were regarded suspiciously at Rome. So in other words, he himself, Mr. Lindzeman, knew that that term was negative. You view Paul suspiciously, or he's under advisement that we can't we can't treat him as fully any apostle or other things because of what he believes in and what he was teaching. Anyway, so I just bring that up that I want you to see a presentation of somebody else presenting the issues about Paul as raised by Tertullian against Marcion before you can see, because he's an English historian, and he's going to give an objective view. He's not a Christian. He's just making an analysis of what the words on the page mean, and that way you can be sure that there's no spinning of anything. And then later you'll see I'm going to present the actual full texts, and you'll get even a stronger picture than this English historian. So let's go. Okay, I'm talking about English historian Edwin Johnson, 1842-1901. He does a work called Antiqua in 1887, a work called Antiqua Mater, a study of Christian origins, and he studies all the early church, all the major works. I mean, very thorough, very careful, and he has one passage, one set of not that many pages where he's discussing what Agianst Marcion said, and he read enough of it to make a good assessment. So anyway, he wrote as follows, beginning at page 236-37. He says, it is clear that Tertullian had no liking for Paul. So that's not me saying it. He hints that Paul's censure of Peter and the other apostles for their Judaistic leanings is inconsistent with his own, meaning Paul's own after practices, which means how he practiced. Did he practice hypocrisy around the Jewish leaders, that he would pretend to be do what the Jewish leaders asked him to do to fake them out, and he had accused Peter of withdrawing from the Gentiles because he didn't want to look like he was associating with them when the people from James came. So the very thing that Paul accused Peter of in the book Agianst Marcion, Tertullian brings this up, and he doesn't seem to care for the fact that Paul criticized Peter for the very thing he did. That's a very common theme, by the way, later in his Christian history, is that always keeps coming up. Jerome, Origen, they spend books on the hypocrisy of Paul over circumcising Timothy and going through the Nazirite vow in Acts 21. So he's bringing that up. So this guy knows his stuff. And then he says he calls him the heretics apostle, the hereticorum apostolos, which I told you is created some controversy with myself and the Early Church 101 website. They were trying to claim it's not as negative as it sounds, but Lindzeman thought so, and so does this English historian Edwin Johnson. Also, I want to read, this is page 236 of his book, and this is where he calls him the heretics apostle. I mean, he's repeating what Tertullian says. So anyway, here we go. It is clear, I'm going to repeat it again, it is clear that Tertullian has no liking for Paul. About that third heaven, he says, we will see should we come further to the discussion of your apostle. He hints that Paul's censure of Peter and the other apostles for their Judaistic leanings was inconsistent with his own after practices. I explain that. He would be all things to all men. He calls him the heretic's apostle. So he's bringing up embarrassing things. Paul talks about being all things to all men. That's basically what? You put on a false face. What is the meaning of hypocrisy? You wear a mask to hide behind that you are not really who you don't want to appear the way you really are. And so that's not me. That's this objective historian, and he's not anti anything in particular. He's just summarizing what he can see as church history. Okay, he goes as far as he dares in suggesting doubts. This is Tertullian goes as far as he dares in suggesting doubts about Paul and his apostleship. So that's exactly what I would have said. He goes as far as he dares. He's writing to Christian audiences. He is sensitive to many of them like Paul, but he's going as far as he can to make negative statements. To those who reject Acts, he says, who is that Paul of yours, the supposed author of Galatians? What was he before he was an apostle, and how did he become one? Everything has a beginning except God. He desiderates the origin of the apostle from Marcion. So he's basically deconstructing Marcion's ability to use him. In general, a believer for believing's sake, as Tertullian is, here he protests against rashness. He assumes the air of a bold skeptic. A man is affirmed to be an apostle who is not to be found in the album of the apostles in the gospel. And then I hear that he was chosen by the Lord. Just give me a moment. Already resting in the heavens. He's quoting Marcion. So not Marcion. He's quoting Tertullian. He's saying, you know, I want to know what proves that Paul is an apostle, and he's saying I can see the circumstances. Is Yeshua, Jesus, is already resting in heavens. So has he not planned everything before he left? He's got to do some emergency surgery and come down and do something. It seems to me a want of forethought, as it were, that Christ did not know beforehand that he was necessary, meaning Paul was necessary to him, but that when the office of the apostolate had been already ordained, meaning he's given away 12 offices and ordained Matthias in Acts chapter 1 to replace Judas, and they had been dismissed of their labors, he thought Paul must be added. So after Jesus had set it all up with 12 people, had Matthias added, you know, he's saying, he's being skeptical. Why would Jesus have to do that? Like, hadn't he planned this out? So he has got to come back just for Paul? And this by an inrush, not by foresight, by necessity, so to say, not by free will, meaning, you know, Paul doing all this evil stuff, he's got to come in there and stop him somehow and then give him a reward of being an apostle on top of it all. So, okay, so that's the quotes. Okay, so next, Mr. Johnson describes Tertullian. Tertullian goes on, and in his witty way to challenge the Pontic shipmaster Marcion, whether he has never taken smuggled or illicit goods on board his small craft, whether he has never thrown overboard or tampered with the freight. If he is too cautious and faithful in God's affairs for that, will he inform us under what bill of lading he took up the Apostle Paul, who stamped him with his title, who forwarded him to, give me a second, to Marcion, who handed him on board so that he may be landed in confidence and not be proved the property of one who has brought forward all the instruments of his apostleship? The arrogant temper of Tertullian takes particular offense at the pretensions of the writer of Galatians to be an apostle, not from men, nor by man, but by Jesus Christ. So what he's basically saying here is he's challenging Marcion and said, hey, how can you prove that Paul is an apostle of Jesus Christ? And what he's saying is he's challenging arrogantly is the point, or that's what he's saying, that Paul claims to be an apostle not from men, nor by man, but by Jesus Christ. So he's saying there's only one person who did this. It was not voted by the 12. And yet he can't prove it. By the very definition of how Paul narrowed his field of proof down, it has to be Jesus Christ, not from man, not from men. So he's excluded the 12. They're not the ones who made the decision, just Jesus. Oh, and then this continues, and this is very important. He says, anybody may make a self-profession. This is much better in Tertullian, but I want you to hear, I'm not the one reading him negatively. He's reading him being negative about Paul. Anybody may make a self-profession, but the authority of a second person is required to confirm it. So he's going to give examples, but the Bible, the law itself says you have to have two to establish anything. So he goes on. He says, one scribes, another subscribes. One seals, another enters the record. A man cannot both profess and be witness to himself. Okay, these are good summaries, but Tertullian is much better. Besides, we read that many would come and say, I am Christ. I want you to think about what passage he's referring to. And if a liar could say this, how much more might not a liar declare himself to be an apostle of Christ? So there's so much there. So Tertullian, and this is Johnson summarizing him, is referring to when Jesus says, if somebody says that they've seen me in the wilderness and they say that they're me, then they're not me. They're lying. That's not how I'm going to appear. No, I'm not going to have any private appearance to just a few people or a little group. When I appear again, I've ascended into heaven. When I ascend into heaven, I'm not coming back unless every eye on earth sees me. So you can rule out any effort of some intermediate appearance of me on earth. Some people ask me, well, what about Apostle John? Read carefully. There's an angel who is speaking the words of Jesus, and Jesus is not actually present on earth. And it's the angel who's talking the words of Jesus in the first couple of chapters, and then at a certain point, Jesus literally raptures him into heaven. That's the word that's used, and he takes him up into heaven where he had been the entire time, and that's where John has all those other visions you see, and that's where Christ was throughout the entire book of Revelation. So it's a different context. But here, Paul is claiming he's on the road to Damascus, and someone comes in and says, I am Christ. And that's again, Tertullian is hitting on key issues that it's impossible not to see the negativity in them, and not in a mean way, but just simply by the biblical use of verses and concept that Jesus gave us to protect us from false prophets. Anyway, so many would come and say, I am Christ. And then this is a very good logical statement. So if someone would come and lie and say that I am Christ, well, wouldn't it make sense that people would actually lie and declare themselves to be an apostle of Christ? Well, of course. If you're going to lie about being the most important figure in human history, you might as well lie about one of the 12 just below him. The 12 below him are the next most important level. So why wouldn't somebody lie and claim to be an apostle of Jesus Christ, who is not one of the 12? So this is Roman logic, and it's perfect. It's right on. But again, you can see this is negativity that Johnson is pointing out. It's not coming from my embellishing it. It's how you read it. That's what it's saying. So here's what he says about Tertullian: excellent critical principles. That's exactly what it was. Good thinking, using Bible verses to figure things out. Only the application of them to the question of the origin of the apostolate in general would have disconcerted the assurance of Tertullian. Now he's going to tell you a very interesting reason why Tertullian still holds on to Paul in some sense as prophesied by God in what's known as the Benjamie Wolf prophecy. We're going to get to that in a minute. I think it's the next panel. Yeah, here it is. And I have a whole video on Benjamie Wolf prophecy, and I'll comment on in a minute. But I want to read this verse, this panel here. So this is Johnson summarizing Tertullian. However, he is willing to accept Paul. Tertullian is willing to accept Paul as approved. On what grounds of authentication? So it's not in the Bible. It's not in the New Testament. There is no proof. And so what does he resort to? He's going to resort to Genesis 49, verse 27, the Benjamie Wolf prophecy. So let's look at this. So where is his voucher? Will our readers believe it? The proofs of Paul as of Christ are from the instrument of the Creator, namely the Old Testament. Paul was promised to Tertullian from of yore in the book of Genesis, according to the 70. Jacob says, and it's very clever. See, Mr. Johnson just said, if you read it in the 70, the Septuagint the word Septuagint means 70. And in there, you'll see there's a material difference from the version in the Hebrew Bible. And if you, I'll hold on that. And so what's the verse? It says Jacob, so he's going to cite Genesis 49, verse 27. You can see just there underneath where it says Jacob says. And in there, the prophecy is Jacob says, Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, in the latter days, he's prophesying, Jacob's prophesying. Benjamin, a ravening wolf, in the morning shall devour hitherto, and at evening shall give food. Now that's from the 70, from the Septuagint. But in the actual Hebrew, it's the Hebrew word shalal, which means spoils. It divides the spoils. The wolves divide the spoils. It's a negative. It's not a, the wolf now is being nice to, other animals. Hey, have a little bit of what I killed last night. No, this is taking something you've attacked and you've been murdering, and now you're going to divide the spoils and take what you can from what you just killed. And so the early church, many leaders, including Jerome, including Tertullian here, and a couple of others, all said, Paul fulfilled this prophecy of Genesis 49:27. And you want to know something? That memory of that important prophecy has died, because when we were able to see when Christian leaders could see the negativity of the actual Hebrew, and we're no longer buried in the Septuagint, they couldn't any longer promote this, because then it would look like God gave us a wicked ravening wolf, who then, after he was murdering and killing us in the morning, in the evening, when what looked like he was helping us was actually dividing up the church into two along this line of Gentiles and whatever, as a means of more disruption instead of unification of the church. And so that fully fulfills the prophecy of 49:27. I have a whole video to prove to you that's exactly what God prophesied of Paul in Genesis 49:27. Okay, so anyway, so that's the only reason that Tertullian said he holds on to Paul, because otherwise all the proofs he's giving take him away completely. You cannot sustain Paul being an apostle, and that's really the key for Marcion, because Paul is his only apostle, and essentially his only primary scripture, where he just uses a little bit of the Gospel of Luke, or he uses much of the Gospel of Luke for his gospel, no others. We'll get to that in a moment. So anyway, that's another thing you need to see. What holds Tertullian's interest in not completely coming out and just saying stop. Christians should no longer even be listening to Paul. He's committed to this concept that the words in the Septuagint 70 said Paul in the evening would divide the food. So there must be something God intended us to digest. That's what he's getting at, and that's why he's committed to that point of view. Okay, so Johnson continues in his summary, and he says, after the cite to Genesis 49:27, he says, here, Paul, of the tribe of Benjamin, in early life, the persecutor, so meaning in the prophecy it was in the morning he would devour his prey, and then in the evening he would divide the shalal, the spoil, but this was translated as food. And so he says, as Tertullian understood it, in the declining years he would be the pastor of Christ's sheep and teacher of nations is foreseen. So that's the only reason why he accepts him for anything. When you boil it down. So Johnson is very astute. He's looking carefully at the real balance of what's holding Tertullian along that line, that he will not completely renounce Paul. And then he gave another proof that he thought that Paul was blessed by God. King Saul, in his relations to David, is another type of Paul, as David himself of Jesus. Such are the sacrament of figures combined with the acts which Marcion must not deny, that convinces Tertullian. So he had another reason that's extremely allegorical, so that's not persuasive to Christians, but that gave him another secondary reason to accept Paul. Okay, so now Johnson asks the question, is he denying Paul then? So he says no, he defends him and expels Marcion from the defense of him. In other words, he fights with Marcion for the true portrait of Paul, who must in some way be found to belong to the Creator and his instrument, the Old Testament, and the prophetic spirit, as Tertullian Paul, in short, and not a Marcionite Paul, the apostle of the other Christ, the teacher of a strange and new God. Okay, so that is fair. So so you will not see him completely renounce him, and he's going to try to find a way to save him, but he's not going to give ground on Paul being an apostle of Jesus Christ. And he's going to definitely throw out the idea that he's, he could have been under a misimpression or something of who he was on that road. So again, Johnson very objectively is going to say the following as a few pages on. Tertullian himself, while expressing the most audacious doubts as to Paul, turns the writings ascribed to him to the account of Catholicism. He's projecting that would be in the future, which is true. Roman Catholic Church took to Paul because he was anti-Sabbath, and they needed to shift it to Sunday, which would be the day that Constantine wanted in honor of his god Sol Invictus, and endeavor to force the Paul of the Acts of the Apostles upon his contemporaries. All right, so Johnson is saying this is to make sure that we all still had to follow Paul in some way. In the absence of historical evidence, that from the ideal world is strong. Paul is the ideal Benjamin, or the Saul of the latter times, the converted persecutor of the fold. Tertullian be our witness. So this is Johnson just making a statement of we have to go along with a Tertullian Paul for the moment. Okay, so what I want to give you a heads up on the next series here is going to be on these actual proofs, so you can hear them with your own ears and make your own determination whether he made convincing case. So I've barely scratched the surface here with Professor or English historian Edwin Johnson, just barely enough that you can understand that any objective person would see the negativity to and the limit and the scope that it was. It was to just defend basically the church from losing out to this movement that was just going to make Paul basically their God. Everything he said was biblical. The Gospels are going to be truncated down to fit Paul now completely. And, he saw that could be the end of true Christianity. You'd have this dispensational division between Paul and Jesus, and it would crush the true Church of Christ, which, by the way, this is where we are now, and that's why we're doing this video to help us wake up and realize this has happened before. It's built into the problem, and we need to solve it this time and not have this happen again. And so anyway, we're going to pick up next time, and we're going to actually listen and hear the words of Tertullian. They're very, very powerful words. So God bless you. I hope this was a big help, and see you next time. Ciao.